So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Before we start, I want to say thank you for tuning in. It means a lot to me. I know that you're busy people, and the time that you turn on this podcast and listen to it means a lot, a whole lot. And I hope that I do a good job in bringing before you on a weekly basis amazing people. And today actually is a very, very important conversation, I have to say. By the way, if you like what you hear, please pass it on to your friends. We are building a podcast listenership, and I'm trying to get a lot of people listening to the people I bring on because they're great people. And today is no exception. It's a great pleasure to welcome today to my show Mark McConville. He is a PhD. He is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Cleveland, Ohio. He has a specialty in adult, adolescent, and emerging adult and family psychology. He's also a senior faculty member at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland. Dr. McConville, welcome to the Hamilton Review.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. And Mark, listen, you've written a beautiful book. We're going to talk about, by the way, he's written a book called Failure to Launch. We're going to talk about failure to launch a little bit later on in this show. A subtitle of Why Your 20-something Hasn't Grown Up and What to Do About It. So we're going to talk in detail. But before we get to your great book, which I am in the process of reading, I want you, if you would be kind enough to tell all of our listeners a little bit about your background, where you're from, where you're born, where you grew up, and why it is that you became a PhD in psychology and why you're doing what you're doing. So, Mark, the microphone belongs to you.
Wow. Well, how much time do I have?
You got about 3 minutes.
Okay.
No, you got as much. Listen, you got as much time as you want.
I'll give you I'll try to hit the high points.
Okay.
I was born in Rochester, New York. I am one of, I have three brothers from a family that was very education conscious. My brothers were all high achievers. And I had, I don't know, the fortune or misfortune of being the youngest student in my class. So I went off to high school at age 13, and I went off to college at age 17.
Wow.
And,
Wow. That's
yeah,
amazing.
I mean, that would be a rarity today, but it happened back then. And I'd had the curse, I think more of a curse than a blessing, of having been told from a young age that I was smart. And I didn't always feel smart. I kind of liked that attribution. I aspired to be smart, but I didn't always feel smart. I was extremely distractible. What today would be called attention deficit disorder. My dear mother was kind enough to say, Mark, you're very imaginative. And sometimes it's a wonderful thing, and sometimes it prevents you from taking care of business. So I went off to college. I was in mild despair because I was not accepted at the University of Notre Dame, where my two older brothers went, and I think I can easily say I was not really ready for college, and kind of at the last minute I got lightly recruited, to play golf at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. And I was so delighted that somebody wanted me for something. So I went to Duquesne and just trying to stay afloat. I was not a particularly impressive student for the first year or so. I did play on the golf team. And I had a kind of crisis, I would say, at the very beginning of my second year in college, when you had to declare a major, and there really wasn't a great deal that I found interesting at the time. Again, I was, a sophomore in college at 18, and the only thing that piqued my interest at all was psychology. And I think the reason I would, to some extent, it's fair to say I was the black sheep in my family. I was the troubled adolescent. Not terribly troubled by the standards that I have encountered in my own professional work. But I was an anxious kid and unsure of myself, and I think psychology gave me at least the hope, perhaps the promise of trying to understand myself a little bit better. Um, so that beginning of my second year in college, I threw myself into my schoolwork for the first time, really putting my shoulder to the wheel and saying, I need to find out, am I smart or am I just um, pretending? And I did exceptionally well that semester. Two things happened that I at the time mystified me. Today it seems easily explained. The first was that I did very well academically with some very challenging courses. And the second was that I began to have a series of panic attacks. And I don't think I knew the word panic attack, the phrase at the time. And I look back on it and I think, well, when you finally decide to kind of put all your chips in the middle of the table and you're going to really sort of test yourself and see what you're capable of, actually, it makes a lot of sense that someone would find themselves, threatened and anxious and uncertain about
Sure.
whether or not they're going to make the grade.
I,
So,
I think too, Mark, that one of the fact that you were dealing with these things when you were 18, that is a
yeah,
young age. That you're talking about you were thrust into the college at 17, which is just unbelievable.
right.
And the fact that you're 18, these are, if you're being called to make a commitment to a major at that age, I can understand the anxiety that you must have felt.
Yeah. And I think it's particularly because it's the first time I ever really worked hard in school. And I became a successful student. I also had the great good fortune near the end of my first year of meeting a fellow, a co-ed, who I'm now married to. She was a very serious student. And I remember feeling inspired and thinking, I can't be just such a slug when she's saying I need to go back to my room to study. I thought, well, maybe she's onto something. Um, we met on St. Joseph's Day, and we just celebrated the 59th anniversary of the day we met.
Wow.
So, but yeah, so she's just been such an anchor in my life and such a gift, such a blessing. But so I knew as college neared completion, I knew intuitively that I did not want to grow up, and I certainly didn't want to enter the adult world. It seemed too overwhelming and too intimidating. And so I thought, you know what? I finally figured out this school thing. So why don't I just do more of this? So I did. I went on to get a master's degree. I came back to Duquesne. Duquesne um, was at the time in a particular kind of psychology known as existential phenomenological psychology, was the top school in the country. Now, I had no idea. I don't think I could have spelled those words when I went off to college, but their graduate program was just exceptional. And
Hmm.
I went back and got my doctorate there and graduated at 27. And um, I think, and I took a job at a um, brand new large hospital mental health center here in Cleveland, and they it's at some point they needed someone to work with adolescents, and I think because I felt not that distant from them myself, um, I applied for the job, and I was over the moon. I was delighted when they awarded me that position, and I only learned out maybe 6 months later that no one else had applied for it because nobody wanted to work with teenagers.
That would have been information that you probably should never have learned. You could have.
Well, I felt fortunate, but teenagers, we're talking today's teenagers are much more um, sophisticated psychologically, sometimes too aware of their mental health needs, and it's not uncommon at all to find a kid who's quite open to talking to a therapist. But when I started, the therapy meant you were crazy. It was just anathema, and it's not something kids wanted to do. So I really, I had I had an enormous challenge of how to get these kids who were kind of dragged in by their parents, how to get them interested in talking to an adult who could offer them a different kind of relationship, one that would be different from what they were accustomed to. Parents, coaches, teachers, ministers, but someone who could meet them more on eye level and help them learn how to think about themselves. So that's certainly how I got interested in adolescence. And my first book was on adolescent psychotherapy, titled simply Adolescence. Somewhere around the late 1990s, early 2000s, I began to notice in my caseload more and more kids who were, for example, college dropouts,
Yep.
kids maybe in their early 20s who um, parents were looking to get them into therapy or they were asking for help. And just more and more, I had that sensation of this kid is 22, but he feels so much like a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
And so this sort of immaturity and it's sort of out of that work grew my book, the Failure to Launch book. And it's interesting. I had no intention of writing a book. I learned in graduate school to keep what they called an integrative journal, to do journaling that covers what I'm reading and what I'm learning in class, what I'm learning about myself, what I'm learning about my clients or patients. And it was the journal writing was an effort to put all that together and make sense of it. And so I have a stack of journals that's probably 8 inches, 10 inches high to this day. And at the time, I began writing about what do I do to help these kids? Um, and I quickly learned that working with their parents was absolutely critical in helping the kid themselves turn around. These kids they were 22, but they weren't really presenting as young adults. They were presenting more as teenagers who were kind of stuck in their adolescent stage.
Yeah.
That's a snapshot of my bio.
So yes, and that is basically the what you write about. I mean, this book is a book that talks about this phenomenon, and I think that this phenomenon, from my observation in the country, is growing. There are more and more kids who seem to be anxious about entering into the adult world, and there's more options too. There's video games that we did not have. I certainly never had when I was a kid, and there are other things that people can jump into, and you talk about that in your book. But you talk about, and I've read enough of this book to really I'm fascinated. It's a very well written book, by the way, Mark. Good job. But you talk about getting a life, and it seems like these kids are not getting a life. They seem to be afraid of getting a life. Can you speak to that phenomenon?
Yeah, and just incidentally, my proposed title for the book was "Getting a Life,"
Ah,
and the publisher said, "Well, some people will get that, some people won't," and then they lobbied for failure to launch. But you're so right that what kids growing up today, it's a very different world than the world you and I grew up in that entry into the adult world requires, generally speaking, much more education. When I graduated from high school, I could have gone down to Kodak and gotten a factory job that would have made me financially independent within a year or two. Could have, bought my first car within a year or two, put down a down payment on a small bungalow by the time I was, maybe 22 or 23. But those opportunities just don't exist. We've switched from a manufacturing economy to more of a technology economy, a service economy, and those jobs require much more in the way of education. So the kids kind of intuit it at the time they're making that step into college, and particularly so for kids who have trouble with managing their own academic life, kids with executive function issues. The kids who can stick it out and finish college are in a much better position to start with something that will be more interesting and reasonably well paying. So many of the kids that I end up consulting about are kids who just really got kind of knocked out of the saddle by their educational challenges. The managing their own academic life proved to be too much for them.
You concentrate a lot on the transition between high school and college. That seems to be a real pivotal point where kids may have had a persona in high school, who they were, and you mentioned that word actually, persona, in detail in your book. But then suddenly they're graduated, and all of a sudden they're like untethered from their
Yeah.
friends who are splintering. They're going to different colleges, and suddenly they find themselves either in college or not even going to college or whatever. But they've been they're they're kind of lost, and I think that is a very, and I think for those listening today, this is a very critical time. So tell us about that transition between high school and college.
Yeah. I think of high school it's a world unto itself. And if you look at incoming ninth graders, they're pretty insecure. They have a tremendous social anxiety. But by the time someone is in 12th grade, they've usually figured out their adolescent personality, their high school persona. They know who they are, who they aren't. They know where they fit. They know whether they're part of the popular group or they're part of the athletic group. So they have crafted an identity that is far more stable and secure than, say, when they were incoming ninth graders. But they also, they're leaving that world behind, and they're entering a new world, which is, I always think of it as Frodo leaving the Shire in Lord of the Rings, venturing away from what's familiar and comfortable and protective into challenges that are really, they can be imagined, but they're not yet known.
That's right.
And so there is a kind of, however stable that old identity was, it's no longer as functional. And you're like reinventing yourself, which, by the way, for some kids is a very welcome opportunity. They love the opportunity that I'm going to have some more meaningful relationships. I'm going to be maybe more thoughtful, more intellectual, things that I maybe couldn't get away with in high school. Um, but there's also a great vulnerability, because you're trying something out for the first time. You're trying out genuine independence going off to college. And so where I see this become very problematic is the kid who maybe is put on academic probation or is asked not to return to college.
Yeah.
And that clearly that's a failure experience. There's no two ways about it. But what I see in these, 18, 19, 20, 21-year olds is they internalize it as if they were soft clay, and they begin to think I'm a failure, as if that failure defines me. And that's a vulnerability that I think is unique to that transition. It's really true at any stage of life when you take on something that's really new. It's referred to as promotion anxiety. I'm stepping up, I'm taking on new duties, obligations, responsibilities, and as confident as you might be that I can do this new job, I'm untested.
Sure.
And so that's, for any of us, that's when our self-doubts kind of percolate up to the surface. And I think at no stage of life is that more vivid, and is the vulnerability greater than this transition from high school to either the adult work world or to college.
So I think about this a lot, and I'm wondering whether, like for example, in Israel they have a mandated participation in what the IDF, the Israel
Right.
Defense Forces, and it's a 2-year commitment, I believe. And I'm wondering, and I've thought that maybe not in military, but maybe some kind of a national period of 2 years or so would be good for kids. Have you ever thought that thought? And do you think that would be a good thing?
Oh, absolutely. However, I don't know how we would institutionalize it the way Israel has, but on a more individual basis, the idea of doing a gap year has become much more acceptable in the last maybe 2 decades. We go back farther than that, and it was seen, if you were from a family that valued college education, or you went to a school that was college preparatory, not going off to college was viewed as kind of a humiliating failure. But that is not really the case today. There are many more opportunities for gap year experiences. And I find I'm much more likely to recommend it on a case by case basis. And I find both kids and families, it's been de-shamed to a great extent.
Yes.
So there is more receptivity to it. And there are some kids, they just need that time to kind of ripen and to mature.
So you do talk about gap years, but you talk about them being not necessarily just a year off. You talk about them as being times what you call the holding environment is how I think you put it in the book.
Yeah, right.
In other words, they're directed. It is like you just kind of hang out and watch TV all day. You
No.
actually are doing something productive. You're traveling. You're doing something with your life, which is not just kind of hanging around the house for another year.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct about that.
So speak to that because I think this is really, really critical.
Well, if you think of the kid, and I've certainly known many of them who do just hang around the house for another year, and I can't say I've seen very many of them turn it into a constructive experience where they could say at the end of the year that they were wiser or had learned more about life. But kids who do get into volunteer programs or who do traveling, um, I'm thinking of a kid I knew he worked in the California wilderness actually as part of a park crew
Yeah.
and living with a crew. Something that is a learning experience. You think of things like um, Knowles outdoor learning experiences. Now, those tend to be time limited, but you want it to be something where the kid returns with some learning and some wisdom that he didn't have, and confidence,
Yeah.
right? So
And,
yeah,
and,
you're
and
very
I, I,
right.
I think experiences, if nothing, even getting a job. Okay, a lot of kids are not, and I don't know about your world when you were growing up, and in my world, a lot of kids in high school we had jobs. I remember working. I was in the clothing. I worked in a clothing store and sold Levi jeans, 501s. Sold a lot of them. And so I remember having a job, and that was kind of part of of my world, and a lot of people in my school. We all worked in summer jobs in particular, but even getting a job is valuable. Don't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. One way I learned or that amplified that message is when I began to see these kids in therapy who were college dropouts or kids who failed out. The ones whose parents required them to work got a lot better a lot quicker. I was a little disappointed that it wasn't my brilliant therapy work that was getting them better, but they were getting up daily, being someplace on time, working up at the local grocery store. They had a boss who might be very appreciative if they were a hard and reliable worker. They had the experience of the adult world taking them seriously. Now, it's not like they were going to have a career working in the produce department, but they had did so much to shape their sense of self confidence from that sense of am I a failure, right? That from their college experience to no, wait a minute, I can make a contribution. Um, my boss said, "Thank God I'm available to work the Thanksgiving holiday weekend because he doesn't know what they would do without me." That it's a very, very valuable experience, and I would say that certainly counts in the gap year, the menu of gap year possibilities.
It's really, really true. So you talk about the cognitive development that happens between the years 12 years of age and 20.
Yeah,
Could you break that down for us and tell us what are things that are going on in the brains of kids, both
yeah,
boys and girls?
right. Well, we know that those are the years of tremendous development of the prefrontal cortex. The nerves are myelinating, and the prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that allows us to stop and think and consider and anticipate and reflect. And so by 18 or 20, we expect a capacity to be more thoughtful. We expect a capacity to be more insightful. And the way that I like to talk about this is from my vantage point as a therapist. Um, so when I would see a 13 or 14 or 15-year-old in therapy, and I saw more boys than girls because those referrals are often made along gender lines. But the typical presentation, let's say this 14-year-old boy comes in and he tells me about everyone in his life who's making his life difficult, how his father's too strict and his mother's too controlling and his teachers don't and he gives me this litany of the people in his world that are troubling him in some way. And I would listen with a kind of quasi neutrality. I wouldn't quite agree, but I might say things like, boy, that sounds difficult, or, well, I know adults can be challenging sometimes. I would try to let him know I was mostly in his corner. I wasn't buying the whole story. And the typical sequence, there's a kind of a test that I would perform with these kids after I listened to how unfair it was that the Spanish teacher sent them down to the dean's office. And once the kid had told the story and I'd heard it, I would shift and I'd say, so what was your part in this? What was your contribution to the trouble? And it's an invitation to switch from this kind of projective focus where you all are making my life difficult to a reflective focus. Like, well, wait, what's my part in making my life more difficult? And some kids would look at me like, what are you talking about? I just told you the problem is the Spanish teacher.
Right. I
But
am
there
I
are
am
others.
I am perfection impersonated, right? That's
Yeah,
how
yeah,
can you say that? Yeah.
right. And then other kids they'd stop and they'd say, well, I shouldn't have, shouted that expletive as I walked out of the Spanish class, right? Or um, they so you could see this emergent capacity for reflection. And often that's what therapy was. It was I sometimes called it ego tutoring. You were literally trying to cultivate that capacity for looking at oneself and what was my part in it, what might I do differently, how would I handle that the next time around. So that's the part of cognitive development that I find most fascinating, the shift from a projective focus to a reflective focus.
And that happens between 12 and 20. I mean, obviously puberty is going on there too. You have these puberty changes which throw most teenagers into a radical change. And we
Yeah.
see that, it is the kind of thing where they're realizing all of a sudden their body's changing in something in a way that they never, nothing like this had happened before. And I think that is unnerving for a lot of kids actually.
Oh,
But
certainly it's destabilizing. I remember when I was in grad school taking a course in developmental psychology, the professor saying, ages 10 to 12 are like it's the perfect age in the human lifespan. You are complete harmony. You have mastered the challenges of childhood. You still like your parents. You have you give all adults the benefit of the doubt. The world just works beautifully. And then all of a sudden there is this storm of hormonal, assault that changes everything. And it really is. I mean, some kids obviously manage it better than others, but it's
sure,
pretty disruptive.
no,
You don't know who you are.
it's
You don't
hormonal chaos, and it just definitely all of a sudden things are growing and things are changing, and you're getting all these things that happen in puberty, and it does kind of throw you off. And I think look, the vast majority of my patients that I see are okay. I tease them. I kind of go, listen, I'm kind of glad I'm who I am right now. I'm glad I'm not in your shoes, which I'm not sure they always appreciate the humor. But I think they also kind of intuitively know this is a unique time in their life. And most of the kids, they handle it okay. They really do. So these kids who fail to progress, they really fail to launch. What do they look like? And when you see these kids, you describe a lot of them. who one kid named Andrew you talk about is he got into this what you call the bubble world, where he was spending his entire time working with this what you called an other world rather than or a substitute world rather than the real world, and he was playing video games.
Yeah.
Tell us what these kids look like.
Well, he was kind of a unique, I wouldn't say unique, but he was a particular profile. This was a kid who had some real family crisis. He was not, his parents were both fairly distant. They were both professionals. Um, and right around the time he graduated from high school, his mother quite abruptly announced that she was leaving his father. And his father was a university professor, very self-absorbed. So he was kind of orphaned at 18. He didn't really have guidance. A very bright kid. Um, I don't. I think he may have tried college and kind of dropped out. And what he did is he fell into a game that it for some time was very, very popular, called World of Warcraft, and literally a world. I never played it, but I had any number of clients describe it. You had an avatar character, you had an identity, you belonged to a guild, it was really very absorbing, and that became when I call it a bubble world, it was something for him to. It was like a substitute for the real world, um, and in that substitute world, you took on challenges and you had successes and you made relationships and you found mentors and you did all the things that you really need to be doing in the real world, but doing it in this much more controlled virtual world. The thing that I would say is sort of signature for these kids who are failing to launch is that they have not developed what today we commonly call executive function. You know, the ability to be the director of my own life, to kind of um, make a schedule and set objectives and parse challenges into, component tasks, all of the things that make someone a good student. But also, if you're a worker, it's what enables you to get yourself to work on time and to understand your task and to pull it off. And a lot of these kids haven't developed that or haven't developed it sufficiently. And part of the consequence of that is they find the adult world to be mystifying and terrifying, as if they were being thrown, to the wolves. And the most reliable strategy they come up with is avoidance.
Yeah.
So, that the World of Warcraft was a magnificently successful avoidance of the real world.
That's. I think you're absolutely right, and I do see that in some of my patients who are totally addicted to these video games. And I have to say, I I give them a hard time about that. I said, listen, and I give the parents. I say, you guys need to turn that darn thing off, no matter what. You talk about part of that is just the fear that they're not capable. And you also talk about this whole idea of interdependence, not independence, which I think is a
Right.
very, very important point. Can you speak to that the difference between interdependence and independence?
Yeah. Well, I think, and this, by the way, it's much more of a plague and a curse for males in our culture, because we have some, gender, um, you might call them shame codes. What is a man supposed to be a real man? What's a woman supposed to be a proper woman? And the shame codes for men have a lot to do with utter independence. I think of the heroes of John Wayne or Rambo. These are or Dirty Harry. These are men who don't rely on anyone but themselves, and so that becomes a kind of mythic, um, a powerful mythic um, presence in our lives. The cliche about men not wanting to stop and ask for directions. It's true. It's absolutely true. I learned in my maybe sixth decade of life how to stop and ask for directions. And I felt about as good as if I'd learned to speak French fluently. It was like, wow, I never thought I could learn to do that. And it's just, it's so ingrained that is somehow an expression of weakness or inadequacy. But the reality is
But
none of us makes it.
by the way, thank God for GPS. Okay,
Yeah, I know. That
it,
solved the problem.
it really did, because I got myself in trouble more than once on that one. But anyway, now I can just go, oh, look at the map. I'm right there.
I know, and who would believe it? Siri gives me directions and I follow them. I do as I'm told.
That's right.
I don't argue with her at all. Um, but it's so toxic for men. And if you look at real people who make something of themselves, they always do it with the help of others. It may be in the form of an actual mentor. It may be a peer who's already had that experience and knows how to manage it. But it's somebody that knows more about something than I do myself. And it could simply be asking someone who's wearing a uniform in an airport, which direction is concourse C? It's but it also can be bigger relationships, mentors and professors. And so it's interdependence is what really delivers us to eventual competence. But we have to somehow break through the shame that somehow we're not supposed to do that, that as if interdependence was dependence.
Yeah.
It's not.
No, I completely agree. And I mean, listen, ultimately, in the world we live in, we need interdependence. We need accountants. We need dentists. We need all these different people that we rely as adults. We rely upon all these people to help us manage life, right? And
Right.
we riff and we surf off of their knowledge. Thank God it's there, and it's a good thing. So interdependence, and I think that you're right. I think that sometimes kids, they kind of go, well, I should know that, or I should learn that, or I should whatever. No, it's okay to ask, ask for help. So one of the things that I think that people are wondering about is, what can parents do during while their kids are teenagers that optimizes the odds that their kids will successfully navigate these transitional periods. What are
Yeah.
the things? Do you have any list of things that you think are the best that parents can actually implement before that senior year where they fall off the world,
Yeah.
but earlier in
Yeah.
the teenage lives?
Yeah. There's I have this phrase I've come to use a lot with clients lately. I call it a parent tutorial. Your kid has to do something simple, make a doctor's appointment. And most parents make those appointments for their kids, right? It's what parents do. But it's actually better if you say to your kid, "Here, come over here, sit down. I'm going to call the doctor's office and make this appointment, and I just want you to listen to see how it's done." Um, things where you are introducing the kid to these simple, concrete but practical tasks of managing, and you enlist them in those tasks. Maybe it's course selection in high school. It's going down to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles to apply for a license. So you're getting your kid to see, I can do these things. They aren't that difficult. I had a very interesting conversation with a young man. He was 19. I'd seen him as a 14, 15-year-old in as a client in therapy. And so now he was a college student, and he emailed me to ask if he could come in. And he came in with his mother, and the two of them were fighting like cats and dogs. And I just kind of sat back and listened to this argument. And the argument was about that he needed to cancel a dentist appointment because it conflicted with his summer work schedule. And he was refusing to do that. And I didn't make that appointment. You made it. You call and cancel it. So I'm listening to this crazy conversation. And I finally stopped, and I'll call him Josh. I said, Josh, what do you think happens when somebody calls a dentist office to cancel or to reschedule an appointment? And he says to me, oh, I think they probably get pissed. And I think, you know, dental offices have more no-shows than any medical provider. And the truth is, if you call to reschedule an appointment, they want to send you flowers, right? So I turned to mother, and I said, would you mind calling the dentist's office on speakerphone and reschedule the appointment? And you know what happened there. Oh, Mrs. Smith, thank you so much for calling. Oh, no problem. How about next, Friday afternoon? And she gets off the phone, and I give Josh one of these things my mother used to do to me. I look over the top of my glasses, right? And he just kind of drops his head and says, "Oh." But there are so many of those sort of little practical tasks of managing the the business of living that we could have kids participate in more. There are other things like I have granddaughters whose parents have them the older ones have an app on their phone that manages their money. So that a certain amount has to go in. If they get $20 for babysitting, a certain amount has to go into savings, a certain amount has to go into charity, and so they are learning in this fashion with adult oversight. They're learning how to be competent around managing money. I can't tell you how frequently I hear the story of a 23 or 4 or 5-year-old who just has no notion of where money comes from or how it's managed. So it's those kinds of things. I will say I had a on a call-in show that I did once. I had a parent call in who said, I have a 3-year-old. What can I do to help prepare my 3-year-old for launching? And I said, well, when the playroom is scattered with toys, you sit down on the floor and you say, come on, the two of us are going to put all these toys back where they belong.
That's
And
right.
it's that kind of participation where you are literally walking the kid through an experience of what it means to manage their life or their environment.
That's so true. You actually have one of the people who writes on the back of your book is a woman named Lenore Skenazy. And I've read her book. Her book is called Free Range Kids. Have you ever read that book? It's an amazing book. But you talk about, preparing your 3. I'm not sure Lenore would let her 3-year-old ride the subway in New York, but I think she let her 7 or 8-year-old kid do it, and it made national news. But I do think that you can early on when kids are young, they can have little tasks to do. They can help with their siblings or whatever. They can learn how to pick up the dishes. There's a lot of things that kids can do even when they're young.
Yeah, and that makes me think of something like chores. There's a way of getting kids to buy in more, and it's called negotiation. So, let's say I have a 12-year-old, and that 12-year-old, he is going to contribute. He's either going to empty the dishwasher or take out the trash or walk the dog. He's going to do something. Now, I can use an authority model, right? I can say, look, Luke, I want you to empty the dishwasher, turn the TV off and empty. I can do that. That's using my authority. Or I can take an approach that says, look, we have a bunch of things to do here, and I need your help. So the dog needs to be walked, and the dishwasher needs to. I can give them this list. Which one do you think would work best for you?
Mm-hmm.
And when do you think now? Can you do that now, or no? You want to finish this? So I let him sort of be part of the process of deciding what to do and when. Now, if he's 12, he's going to negotiate a good deal, and he's not going to keep his end of it because that's what 12-year-olds do, right? But you're teaching the process of buying in. So the next time around, it's like, no, buddy, you're getting up now and you're walking the dog. That's all there is to it. But you're teaching them that there is exchange and that they can influence you. Dad, I don't want to walk the dog. Let me just, do the dishes.
Yeah.
You're having them participate in the management of household chores more the way you would do it with a roommate. It's not on the menu that they can do nothing, but you want them to feel some ownership of what they agree to do. And kids do, they do buy in more if they feel they've had some influence on the process.
Absolutely. I think it's a matter. Listen, this whole thing of failure to launch is tricky because even in wonderful families, you can definitely see this phenomenon. sometimes it's inexplicable. I think, maybe there are drugs or other things that are going on that factor into that phenomenon. But I do think that this is a big issue, and it's becoming an issue with certainly with some of my patients. I'm seeing that this is something that is great, brings great pain to parents, and I think planning ahead and looking ahead is what they have to do, and part of it is just engaging the kids early on in adult things. And the more you do that, I think the better chance you have to these kids launching successfully.
Yeah, very succinctly put. That's right on target.
So listen, we're gonna finish up right here, Dr. McConville. You've been a wonderful guest on this show, and I thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. It's an honor to participate.
And friends, thank you for tuning today into the Hamilton Review. We've had a great conversation with Dr. Mark McConville. He wrote a beautiful book called Failure to Launch. The subtitle is Why Your 20-something Hasn't Grown Up and What to Do About It. This is well written, and I think it's a great book to pick up if you're heading into that time in your life with your kids. So, friends, until next time, I appreciate you listening, and be well. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.